Hi, my name is Elena, and I will be giving a presentation on what I learned from this course. This course is called Introduction to Indigenous Studies, and that's exactly what it is. It introduces you to the history of Indigenous peoples and the issues that they have faced since the inception of Canada. I am in the accounting program at Brock, and I chose to take this course because of the recent changes at our school. Growing up, most exposure to social issues at school were limited to the occasional fundraiser, so I came to an understanding that the school, like the government, doesn't do much for anyone permanently. It surprised me when there were suddenly land declarations left and right and informative fixtures in the lobby. It seemed like whatever the indigenous peoples were doing was here to stay, so I decided to learn more about it. After going through the course content, I am left with a bitter taste in my mouth at the systemic injustice suffered by indigenous peoples at the hand of colonialism. Recurring motifs include the loss of children, violence and unfair treatment against the vulnerable, the consequences, and the resilience of the survivors. Settler values continue to threaten indigenous worldviews today by smothering the truth with Eurocentric laws and regulations and drawing on negative emotions from the clash of beliefs. Today, I will be discussing five major topics covered by this course and the connections I drew from them. One of the first things we learned about were the foundations of Indigenous worldviews. The course content emphasizes how the Indigenous peoples believed in relations beyond just people, extending to plants and the land. In Braiding Sweetgrass, Kimmerer blends the scientific structure of a lab report with storytelling elements to elaborate on our reciprocal relationship with the land. I enjoyed it because it was a lighter read and it reminded me of my times as a biochemistry major where it took hours to hammer out reports before I finally no longer had to write anything else up when I switched to accounting. I also found the creation stories very interesting. This slide features a picture of a muskrat because it is the hero of both stories I read. Both stories featured a lineup of animals attempting to dive to the bottom of the water so they could retrieve the dirt there and use it as a land base on a turtle's back. Many animals failed and lost their lives until the muskrat tried. He was small and weak, but he was courageous and he found success. I liked that. I've always liked rooting for the underdog, and it was even better that he did it for not just himself, but for the community. I also found it interesting how the Anishinaabe story featured a great flood to wipe out all evil in the beginning. I instantly thought of the parallel to Noah's Ark from the Bible. Water does symbolize strength and purity across nations, but also the significance of land is quite distinct to the indigenous peoples. Before moving on to the next slide, I want to add that spirituality is ingrained in indigenous cultures along with relations. Indigenous peoples fundamentally lived different from settlers who worshiped one true God per religion, and nowadays even religion is optional. In contrast, indigenous peoples consider their relationship with people, plants, and land, and their ancestral knowledge along with that. We all want to know where we came from and what to do, but indigenous culture weighs the impact faced by plants and land as heavily as people. Maybe that's what we need right now. The next topic I'd like to discuss is how the history between settlers and indigenous peoples went from bad to worse. In the beginning, the English colonies built a relationship with indigenous peoples to fight off the common evil known as the French. After they succeeded and the French retreated, settlers realized they needed more land to expand, and indigenous peoples happened to be on those lands. Using European standards, they created the Indian Act, and the indigenous peoples decided to move forward with it because they had to begin somewhere. They were also under the preconception that treaties were a continuous effort rather than sign once and done. Over time, indigenous peoples were forced off their lands and into reserves to the point that they could no longer be self sufficient. What really sealed their fate were residential schools. Children were forcefully removed from homes with the goal of converting them from savages to upright Christian citizens. Real children experienced cult like violence and abuse. under the noses, and sometimes even encouraged by the non-Indigenous population. The Indian Act legally classed Indigenous peoples as a different type of people, and the effects were the worst of what it sounds like. By the way, the picture on this slide is from the Woodland Cultural Center, established in 1972, after the Mohawk Institute closed in 1970. I used the Canadian Encyclopedia's website to find the nearest residential school near me, and this was it. My dad was actually born in 1973, so he wasn't even alive when this happened. The last residential school closed in 1997, and I am hearing about all this just now, and only because I actively chose to take this course. Today, the Woodland Cultural Center runs Indigenous events and offers both in-person and virtual tours for $10 a person. Is it right to charge a person to explore the halls where children suffered? Is it right for lawyers to charge so much to defend Indigenous peoples? Today, everything comes at a price, especially knowledge and justice. The next topic is the stolen generations. From the 60s to the 80s, children were taken from their homes and put into child foster systems. One of the big initiatives was acronymed as AIM for Adopt an Indian/Métis. Some children were even shipped to the States. It was like adding insult to injury when survivors coming out of residential schools had their children taken away too, allegedly from neglect. It varied case by case, but there were children actually in terrible conditions because the survivors from residential schools were not, in fact, equipped to be upright Christian parents or functioning members of society as promised. This image is an ad from a Regina newspaper in 1972, and it isn't even the worst of them. Some ads make it seem like the children come from nowhere instead of being forcibly removed from families. And you can see that this girl, Gwen, is marketed as a hot commodity. However, she's a human being. The next topic is Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people. As mentioned earlier, society is structured differently in Indigenous culture. Although it is an English word, Two-Spirit is not as definitive as terms like gay or lesbian, which mean clear things to most people. The term Two-Spirit isn't enough to fully encompass the difference in treatment and identity, but it is better. Unfortunately, Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people are often the targets of hatred. Sometimes the perpetrators are truly sick people who will commit evil no matter what, but from the beginning, if Indigenous peoples, Indians, are legally viewed as different or even less, that makes a person more inclined to treat them worse. For example, a devout Christian man can turn on a woman quicker than a pin drops if he realizes she sells her body, but their hatred for an Indian is ingrained in them from the start. As an Indigenous woman or Two-Spirit person, being different on top of different is even more vulnerable. Yes, the statistics for women and LGBT people are bad, but if you look at the Indigenous percentage proportionately, it is even worse. Anyway, I actually did not know about the Red Dress Day until it was broken down for me in a recent lecture. The picture on this slide is sourced from an article published by Sarah Ackles for the Brock community. It was taken on campus, and this picture alone shows 3 dresses. Each dress represents one woman, and there were many other dresses throughout the campus. Yet altogether, they would not make up every woman out there affected. Still, if people knew what these dresses meant, they would not be so quick to dismiss them. The final topic I will cover is the issues Indigenous peoples face when interacting with health and justice systems. If you ever take a look at Canada's laws, they are not in favor of the common people. For Indigenous peoples, it is even worse. Before coming in contact with the law, people in positions of law enforcement have an ingrained prejudice against Indigenous peoples. Maybe there isn't coverage of mobs lynching black men, like To Kill a Mockingbird, but you would be surprised at what happens under our noses today. In a conflict, the forces that be will mostly take the non-Indigenous side. Oh, they're a repeat offender, a chronic drunk, a substance abuser, they say. Even if so, we should pause and take a look at why. People seeking healthcare are also faced with the same prejudices. Many people are denied because experts mistakenly believe that it's just desserts. Combined with the lack of funding, the relatively innocent people, people who don't take drugs, drink alcohol, all that, they take it the worst. They need to live with a loved one dying from something they have no control over after trying their best. If that doesn't push them into the cycle, their fortitude borders on insanity. I included this infographic on the side because it was really that crazy. After learning that it costs over $100,000 on average to keep a male prisoner in jail for a year. My parents don't even earn that much a year, making an honest living. If the budget for convicts is this steep, one might just think it would be more beneficial to spend it on prevention and rehab instead of locking someone up forever. One might even consider restorative justice within the realms of possibilities. Finally, it's time to make connections. From these topics, we can see that Indigenous peoples were shunned because they were different. They were taken advantage of because they had something that Canada wanted. When Canada waltzed in and said, finders keepers, they didn't consider Indigenous peoples as the original finders and keepers. They barely considered them as humans, and through this view, settlers treated them as less. It never mattered that Indigenous peoples technically didn't own their lands by their own standards because colonizers were always going to take it along with their children, women, culture, and language. To say Indigenous peoples suffered is an understatement. Many still suffer today, and it's cyclical, carried from generation to generation. Children abused in residential schools and the foster care system grow up to abuse and be judged for how they turned out. A common question is, should they be blamed for what happened to them, or should they stand firm on their own feet and move on? Most people who are not affected would be inclined towards the latter. This theme of right and wrong actually reminded me of the Korean movie Parasite, where a lower income family works for a higher income household, and one of the lower income family members goes crazy and kills them all. On the surface, you will think it is the killer's fault, but the narrative portrays Korean society as having a distinct wealth gap, with the killer being born and raised in a basement, frequently flooded by rain, needing to climb up to shelf height just to hijack his neighbor's Wi Fi. This movie showed an extreme case, and that is often what we see in the news. As Canadians, do we have a responsibility to what our ancestors did if individually we are our own people struggling to live? Do Indigenous people who were forced away from their lands generations ago, with the current generation born into poverty, far removed from their lands, have the right? While these questions are similar, they are entirely different. If we try to choose a starting point, Canadians in the current generation are barely connected. Yet our ancestors did do Indigenous peoples wrong, no questions asked. So who should take the blame? Who is Canada as a whole? This situation reminds me of the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, where a clip of a few radically sorry white people apologized to Black people for being born and apologized for their privilege. This is exactly what we should not be working towards. As Arthur Manuel said in his TVO interview in 2015, he, along with many others in his community, believe that all Canadians have a right to live here. Instead of assigning blame, the Indigenous community wants to work towards healing. Again, the resilience is quite insane. What we can do now is acknowledge our differences and spread awareness through grand and simple everyday acts. Change will trickle down even if it seems like all 94 calls to actions will never be fully fulfilled. This course has made me more hateful and angry as a person. As always, I'll take any opportunity to say that the government is bad, and this course has strengthened that view even more. I am still in the thick of it, but I believe that once I come to terms with this rage inside of me, I will have grown as a person. One of the things that angered me the most was Vowel's passage where she explained humans being converted into human flagpoles. How could indigenous peoples be used to gain more land but barely have any of their own? How could Canada be so greedy? There is no way they need that much land. If there was any time settlers could ask themselves if this was what they needed, if this was what their relationships, plants, and land needed, it would be then. Anyway, in terms of my future goals, I will be a bit more informed in the world of accounting if I ever encounter Indigenous issues. I will also be more understanding. It is, in fact, bad to perpetuate stereotypes. Also, before I consume the next new thing, I should ask myself if my relationships, plants, and the land needs it. Relationships are a vital aspect of life. Personally, taking this course has only reinforced this. The Indigenous framework of healing and truth is not the easiest path, but sometimes you need to take the road less walked.